We meet as your conversation already has been indicating in stressful times and disturbing times. And it's not that we're picking up something tonight that is totally unrelated to. This is part of the world from which we have come, and part of a world which has created something of the world we find ourselves in, perhaps at the moment. But we're looking this evening at owning institutional racism and white supremacy. You probably know David Olusoga. He's an Anglo-Nigerian historian who does a lot of broadcasting on television and well known for his series on following the different occupants of a house in a street over a century and more very often. And he unearths a most amazing local history and social history in that television series. He writes about other things as well, and he has been very involved and active in countering racism, and through his teaching and his broadcasting on BBC. But he grew up in Gateshead in the northeast of England, and in the Council Estate, growing up, he was aware of racial tensions, so much so that he felt profoundly unwelcome in Britain. And he felt that his right to regard himself as a British citizen was contested, and he feared that he and his family would be sent back. Now, that would mean Nigeria, where his father came from, and might happen even though his mother was English. And such a dread was not surprising, as in the year that Olusoga was born, the Conservative Party political manifesto pledged to encourage the voluntary repatriation of immigrants. He was still a child when Enoch Powell made his Rivers of Blood speech, and also suggested that those from the new Commonwealth might be happier outside the UK. Powell actually proposed a new British Nationality Act to redefine what British citizenship meant. So the 70s and the 80s were marked by racism, and Olusoga was only 8 years old when the BBC finally pulled the plug on the black and white minstrel show. He remembers his mother rushing across the room to change channels when the show came on so that her mixed-race children would not be confronted by grotesque caricatures of themselves on primetime television. We can look back, I suppose most of us can, and remember that this was also the era of gollywogs on jam jars and gollywog dolls. And when a young girl innocently brought a gollywog doll to school, it caused such humiliation and pain for Olusoga that he still finds difficult to recall. Those of us who were around during that time and who were white watched, and we enjoyed the black and white minstrel show, would not have missed it, and probably wondered why a gollywog doll brought into a school caused such hurt and upset to a mixed race boy. Of course, I'm not a racist, but I have been socialized as a white person into institutionalized racism without realizing it or being consciously aware of it. And none of this is surprising, since I was born into an empire, an Ireland that was still part of that empire and had been part of that empire, even though the sun was setting and the last few slivers of light were becoming dimmer. The empire had been founded on racism and the superiority of white civilization and white Christianity. We were the beneficiaries of the gains and wealth of empire. The person from India who came to our doors on the Ards Peninsula once a week with his suitcase full of cloths and threads was known in the village as the darkie. From somewhere else, tolerated, looked down upon. We had no awareness at all that he had probably fled India or Pakistan and the bloody violence and bloodletting that our empire had caused as it quickly fled the Indian subcontinent after destroying its economy and industry and extracting its wealth. We were not taught that in school. But in Sunday school, in church, some of us did sing about India's coral strand and Greenland's icy mountains, and we collected money for the missions to the benighted children of the empire, and it was so exciting. And it took a long time to realize that we had been socialized into institutional racism. That is hard to acknowledge and throw off. So we look again at the roots of racism. It was in the 16th century that England arrived in Africa, plundered Portuguese boats, seizing the African slaves on board, and then heading across the Atlantic to sell their human commodities, and realized that this could be big business. The big investors were the political elite in England, Secretary of State William Cecil, no less. And the chief investor was the Queen, Elizabeth I. And she was so confident of huge profits that she supplied 2 of her own ships for the second slave trading mission. And the leader of the slave mission, William Hawkins, made a personal profit from the second mission of 60%. And the Queen was so delighted at her profit that she knighted Hawkins. His coat of arms on receiving his knighthood included a female African slave. There were others involved in the slave trade from England. Between 1553 and 1565, there were 9 English expeditions to the West African coast, involving at least 20 large ocean-going vessels and an unknown number of smaller craft. So the slave trade had begun with considerable royal investment. And empire building would go alongside and follow, and all of it constructed on racism, as African slaves were treated as inferior, less than human, and profit-making commodities. Britain would build its empire, not the only empire of the time, but Britain also would build its empire and its great cities on the triangular slave trade of Africa, Britain, and America. The slave trade was European, and Britain was the largest trader. It was known, as we saw, I think, last week, as the European Christian slave trade. And Christian minds and theologians were even working hard, working up theologies of race and trying to rationalize why people in Africa were black. And they decided it was not the ferocity of the African sun, but it was biblical. Taking the Genesis story of Noah, they built a racial theology around Noah's 3 sons as the progenitors of 3 races of humankind. And after the flood, the 3 sons were the only people left on earth to inhabit the earth and produce offspring. Now, women do not feature in this theology, making it difficult to know who gave birth to the offspring, though the logic behind the story would, as they saw it, would suggest that the mothers were the sisters of the 3 sons. These 16th century biblical theologians perhaps had never heard of myth and literalizing and historicizing a story. They concluded then that Ham's descendants were the people of Africa. Somehow this also explained the blackness of Africans. Furthermore, the Noah story has Ham humiliating his father, causing his father to place a terrible curse on Ham, condemning him to become, quote, a servant of servants unto his brethren. This servant status was passed down the generations for all time. Now, the biblical story makes no mention of skin color, but the curse of Ham was racialized, and African slavery was theologically justified. Many, as Olusoga has described it, many interpreted the black skin of the African as the marker of the curse of the endless servitude that Noah had imposed upon the sons of Ham. And who would argue in the 16th century with the authority of Scripture? But it was not just religion that justified racism and slavery. Europe was to define itself by the Enlightenment, claiming the Enlightenment philosophy and thought as European. Reason replaced religion, or what the theologians called revelation, in Enlightenment thought. And we have ended up with sainted philosophers who have been constantly whitewashed. The greatest philosopher of the Enlightenment is Immanuel Kant, whose work has been presented as the basis for anti-racism and as a theology of atonement for the sins of humankind. But as African historian Kehinde Andrews has pointed out in a piece entitled "You Can't, K-A-N-T, You Can't Be Serious," Kant was a violent and ugly racist who saw, quote, humanity at its greatest perfection in the race of the whites. Kant wrote at the peak of the transatlantic slave trade, thought Indians had a meager talent, but that Negroes, his words, are far below them, and at the lowest point are a part of the American peoples. He believed you had to beat Negroes to make them into productive laborers. And for Kant, the rational human of Europe, quote, the white race possesses all the motivating forces and talents in itself. And Kant's racial philosophy, of course, had no basis in any evidence, but was coming out of a racist view of the world. And it became the basis of racial theory believed to be scientific. And white supremacy and racism are to be found in many of the Enlightenment thinkers. And so the Enlightenment thinking of sainted philosophers produced racism, made racism a basis of its thought systems, developing so-called scientific theories of white superiority and Black and Asian inferiority. The Enlightenment, though, also produced European empires. It also shaped the Reformations of the 16th century, both the Protestant Reformations and Catholic Reformations. And we now stand at a point in history when we may be in a transition to a major paradigm shift, a radical shift in thought and consciousness, taking us beyond the Reformations and the Enlightenment paradigm. Now, will the paradigm shift move us beyond the philosophical and theological basis of racism into a world where the full humanity and equality of all is recognized and affirmed in practice, along with the full dignity and worth of nature and the earth? Finally, for this section, America, which developed into an informal empire, some would say, and which may well be coming to the end of its century, was built on slavery and capitalism and racism. When the US was being formed, there was much about freedom and equality. The famous words, "we the people," was at the heart of the Constitution. Quote, all men were created equal. Indeed, the equality and freedom did not include women and Black peoples, nor the indigenous Amerindians. The basis of the US economy was built on the abduction and enslavement of African people, the genocide of indigenous people, and the taking of the land from Mexico. And the colonizers arriving in North America from Europe may well have been fleeing oppressive systems and looking for freedom and opportunities for a new life. But they were arriving in America with their own assumptions of white superiority, domination, and submission. And from the outset, America was founded on a huge tension between the noble ideology of equality and freedom and what Robin DiAngelo has described as the reality of genocide, enslavement, and colonization. So the four pillars on which the US was built were capitalism, racism, slavery, and colonization. And a country was also built on whiteness and the superiority of white people. The term white actually goes back to colonial law in the 1600s. And from the late 1800s through the early 20th century, as waves of immigrants entered the United States, DiAngelo says the concept of a white race was solidified. Even when slavery was abolished in 1865 in the US, whiteness was important for legalized racial exclusion, and the rights of citizenship required legal classification as white. Furthermore, to be American, to be truly American, was to be WASP, W-A-S-P, white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant. And every American president has been white, except Obama, and now an Afro-Indian vice president. And Joe Biden is only the second American president to be Catholic, the other being John F. Kennedy. Could America be described as an empire characterized by institutionalized sectarianism and racism? America as a great melting pot of races and cultures is a cherished idea, and there is much in it to cherish. But in reality, it has been and is white Europeans who dominate and really belong. And even economically poor whites know that to be white is better. Well, let's move into our groups, Loretto, into rooms. And there is a question. The roots of racism are in slavery, capitalism, Enlightenment philosophy, and religion. Well, let's have a conversation for 20 minutes around what we make of that the roots of racism are in slavery, capitalism, Enlightenment philosophy, and racism, and religion. Have a good conversation. 20 minutes. Okay, let's go for the second part. Just before we do, you may be interested in a book. I'll hold it up to the screen. And it's We Were Here. It's called We're Here Because You Were There. And it's about immigration and the end of empire by Ain Sanjay Patel. The title, the author's name's up at the top. Mm-hmm. And it's a very well-written book on the series of immigration laws that began in 1948 in Britain, and others continued. And it shows very much how much racism was embedded and embodied in legislation, and in policies. And also it maybe begins to explain a little also why the up to the moment, I think the UK government's response to Ukrainians is, let's say, rather miserly about the numbers who will come into the country and the length of time it's going to take them to come into the country. But that's a book well worth reading in terms of understanding immigration, racism, and how it's still very much part of the fabric and a legacy of empire and imperialism. Now, to understand racism, we need to understand prejudice and discrimination. And Robin DiAngelo, in her book, has a number of superb, I think, definitions or attempts to say what each of these words possibly mean. Now, here's one. Here's prejudice. This is how she describes prejudice. Prejudice is prejudgment about another person based on social groups to which that person belongs. Prejudice consists of thoughts and feelings, including stereotypes, attitudes, and generalizations that are based on little or no experience and then are projected onto anyone from that group. I think it's worth reading again. Prejudice is prejudgment about another person based on social groups to which that person belongs. Prejudice consists of thoughts and feelings, including stereotypes, attitudes, and generalizations that are based on little or no experience and then are projected onto anyone from that group. Well, what about discrimination then? She describes discrimination as action based on prejudice. And these actions include ignoring, exclusion, threats, ridicule, slander, and violence. Prejudice always manifests itself in action because the way I see the world drives my actions in the world. And everyone, she says, has prejudice, and everyone discriminates. So discrimination is action based on prejudice, actions that include ignoring, exclusion, threats, ridicule, slander, and violence. And prejudice always manifests itself in action. She goes on, when a racial group's collective prejudice is backed by the power of legal authority and institutional control, it is transformed into racism, a far-reaching system that functions independently from the intentions or self-images of individual actors. So this becomes something much bigger. When a racial group's collective prejudice is backed by the power of legal authority and institutional control, it is transformed into racism, a far-reaching system that functions independently from the intentions or self-images of individual actors. So being white is a racial classification, and it's more than that. And here again we come to DiAngelo. She says it is a social and institutional status and identity imbued with legal, political, economic, and social rights and privileges that are denied to others. So white, a racial classification, is a social institutional status and identity imbued with legal, political, economic, and social rights and privileges that are denied to others. Here's another way, perhaps, of looking at it and the extent to which racism, white supremacy is part of a reality. The 10 richest Americans, 7 of whom are among the 10 richest people in the world, are white. The United States Congress, 90% white. US governors, 96% white. Top military advisors, 100% white. Full-time college professors, 84% white. Teachers, 82% white. Those stats are in DiAngelo's book and are taken from sources that have been researched. Another way of looking. A child dies every few seconds in the world from hunger and lack of water. Perhaps every 8-9 seconds, a child dies in this planet from hunger and lack of water. They are not white children. Hendy Andrews puts it this way: the global economy today is built in the image of white supremacy that was so neatly outlined by the Enlightenment thinkers. Africa is the poorest country on earth, while the countries with the white majorities are the richest. So we seem to live consciously or unconsciously within a white racial frame. We even assume symbolic realities, if you want to put it that way. We assume white somehow is neutral, or white is used as a symbol for good. Black becomes a symbol or a language even for bad or evil. Well, here we are, children of European imperialism, European hegemony over the rest of the world. We are children of the European Enlightenment with its white supremacy and reason and progress and individualism. Now, in Ireland, we're not outside empire and colonialism, even if part of the island does feel it's thrown off the imperial yoke. We are still in many ways the beneficiaries, and even the diaspora has largely scattered to the former white settler-dominated English-speaking colonies. And this, I think, is where we need to reflect deeply and robustly interrogate the histories which are part of our narrative, the stories, the language that have shaped us. And it confronts us with a world of inequalities, of institutionalized racism, the continuing struggle with imperial legacies, and the struggle with decolonization, and even what we might call the mirage of post-colonialism. What we cannot do with this engagement, even confrontation with our imperial history and all that goes with it, is to somehow whitewash the sins of colonialism or ignore them or pretend. We're familiar in Ireland with politicians complaining, or at least in Northern Ireland anyway, with politicians complaining about each other rewriting Irish history. Now, in a sense, Irish history or any other history always needs to be written or rewritten as new information and new knowledge come to light. There is a rewriting, though, from an ideological perspective, as narrow tribal and party politics and narrow identity politics try to rewrite history for their own exclusive purposes. Now, the same is happening at times with imperial histories. Ideological attempts to write guided accounts of imperial rule in India or Africa or the Middle East or the Caribbean. And the nostalgia for empire that has dominated Brexit is not only rewriting or an attempt to rewrite the imperial history, but to create a fantasy world on a myth of absolute sovereignty and some kind of global Britain. Now, much of this is a pretense that imperialism as a reality did not exist. A denial of what imperialism really did to the world. We mentioned Enoch Powell earlier. Enoch Powell was the great arch imperialist at one stage in his life, totally in love, if you like, with India. He became someone then who took the stance that imperialism really didn't exist and became a denier of what imperialism really did to the world. That's where he was when he became a Unionist MP for South Down at a later stage of his, at the end stage, in fact, of his political career. And this denial, this kind of denial, may even extend to Ireland and the Irish experience of imperialism and the privilege of whiteness it bestowed upon us. if you get the chance to read this month's edition of History Ireland, or the March-April edition of History Ireland, there is a very interesting researched article on those Irish people who went from here to the sugar plantations and became slave owners and plantation owners. My reading of that piece that somebody sent to me got a bit too close for comfort, because I came across a Hugh Quinn from Portaferry. I'm from Portavogie, 7 miles up the coast from Portaferry, and Hugh Quinn left Portaferry to become the owner of a sugar plantation and the owner of slaves. So we're all, somehow or other, we can be mixed up in a lot of what has gone on in the past. But history is what hurts. And it is the hurt and the suffering at the hands of imperialism, and not just the British version of it, that is now being told. Repressed history is coming to light and is confronting us, as is, for example, Black history. The silence is being broken. And not only is the racial frame being exposed, it's also confronting us with our white supremacy and privilege. Layla Saad, in her book, Me and White Supremacy, writes this: white supremacy is a racist ideology. It is based upon the belief that white people are superior in many ways to people of other races, and that therefore white people should be dominant over other races. White supremacy is not just, she says, an attitude or a way of thinking. It also extends to how systems and institutions are structured to uphold this white dominance. Now, as a decade of Irish centenaries comes to an end, during which I think there has been quite a bit of deep reflection and a robust interrogation of the events of 100 years ago, we may well be entering a decade of deep reflection and robust interrogation now of imperial histories, of colonialism, of slavery and racism. And again, this is not just British imperial history, but it's the history which is perhaps most directly part of our experience and legacy, but it is European imperial history or histories. And these have all shaped our worldview, the racial frame in which we live, and that journey into those histories will be painful, challenging the very basis of our identities and who we are in the world. And we may well resist the engagement with imperial history, slavery, and ongoing enslavement, especially in Africa, and racism and colonialism. Or we may enter into the new paradigm shift and make some kind of new history. But there is an end point that's worth perhaps considering, and that is the broader issue that faces us and with which we are confronted in the present, and that is our willingness, our need or necessity, as we try to come to terms with an imperial fantasist who is acting out his fantasies of imperialism in Ukraine, and the humanitarian crisis that has broken upon us and is day by day now beginning to enter into our country and our shores. How willing will we be, and how prepared do we need to be to look critically and long and hard at our history, not Eurocentric history, but a history which is very much European dominated in the sense. We need now to maybe understand that history from a global perspective, from the perspectives of those who have suffered at the hands of European imperialism and the domination of the planet for the last 500 years. So what has been the role of Europe and the Atlantic West in world history? And where did the 20th century come from? And what are its legacies? And what have we not learned from that 20th century? And now perhaps our white European history has created a Putin, a war, and a threat now to a global order. But there is a painful question. Whose white hands are clean in this present crisis? And if, whenever this is over, whenever that is, or however that is, if we are to somehow to begin to build a new world order again, well, maybe we need to know history, understand it, interrogate it, learn painfully as Europeans from it, and out of the rubble, build a more just, sustainable democracy, not for a few, not for those who have, but for all. Well, we have some time to have a discussion around anything that raises, or to perhaps explore even, have we recognized or not that our world is constructed for white dominance and privilege? What would it mean to recognize this? How painful would that be for us?